Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined today. My name is Amy Batson, and I'm the Executive Director of Women Lift Health. Thank you for joining us for our third of our virtual speaker series events, where we'll hear from three fantastic speakers on how COVID-19 has impacted women in the informal sectors and why the recovery and resiliency efforts must include more to meet their needs. This is part of a series where we're analyzing the gender and power dynamics at play in health emergencies with leaders from across the health and development sectors. Please visit our website for recordings of our previous events. Some of you may know Women Lift Health, but for those who don't, we're an initiative to advance women's leadership in health through concrete action at the individual, institutional, and societal levels. We believe fundamentally that global health challenges will not be solved without greater diversity, most notably women being present at the decision-making tables. I invite attendees to visit the website and follow us on social media for more information on our specific efforts, including the ways that we're partnering with organizations and leaders around the world to support the advancement of talented women leaders. So for today's topic, when the overlooked workforce becomes the essential workforce. Of the 3 billion workers across the world, almost 2 billion of them work in the informal economy. In some countries like India, informal jobs make up the majority of employment. The informal economy is made up of workers that are mostly unskilled and low paid. Many of these workers have vague employment contracts at best and lack any form of social security or welfare safety net. In their world, not working for a day can mean not eating for a day. Typically, the informal economy includes domestic workers like nannies and cleaners and other home care providers, home-based workers, street vendors, subsistence farmers, and waste pickers. And unsurprisingly, most are women. Not only do women make up a disproportionate share of informal workers in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, but they're often employed in the most vulnerable of the informal sector jobs. While COVID-19 has thrown the global economy into a tailspin, it has severely and uniquely impacted this workforce. Ongoing lockdowns have placed their jobs in extraordinarily precarious positions. And being considered essential by the state has not led to the visibility or the rights given to workers in other sectors. We cannot forget the backbone of our society in times of calm or crisis. For many women, this pandemic could be the difference between sinking into a life of abject poverty or having the protections necessary, backed by the state, to protect, feed, and provide for herself and her family. If we care about gender equality, it's vital that we take a hard look at the roles women take on in society, push for their inclusion at every level of decision-making, and demand that the state protect their health and well-being regardless of their profession. Before introducing our speakers, I wanted to go over just a quick few housekeeping items. Please do send us your questions throughout the event. We'll be pulling them together and I will pose them to the speakers at the end during our Q&A session. This session will be recorded and made available on our website and through social media. And finally, if you don't already, please follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @WomenLiftHealth, and feel free to tag us with comments, suggestions, or other questions about today's event. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our three speakers today. Delighted to introduce Dr. Geeta Rao Gupta, who is the Executive Director of the 3G Program for Girls and Women, served as the Deputy Executive Director at UNICEF, and serves as the Chairman of the Women Lift Health Global Advisory Board. Geeta, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm also delighted to introduce Dr. Gautam Ban, who is the Senior Lead for Academics and Research at the India Institute for Human Settlements, where he researches and writes on the politics of urban poverty and inequality, including work on urban health. Gautam, welcome.
Thank you.
And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Laura Alfers, who's the Director of the Social Protection Program at WeGo, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, where she leads the health work and is currently working with global networks of informal workers to develop social protection as a mobilizing and organizing tool. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you all so much for being here today. So to kick it off, would like to explore a little bit around the current situation for female workers in the informal sector. And Laura, if I could start with you, could you paint us a little bit of a picture of what life looks like right now for women working as domestic workers, as home-based workers, and those in other critical positions that help keep our world running?
Thanks, Amy. I'm going to start off complicating the question a little bit. Just to say that I think the informal economy is quite heterogeneous. We tend to have a tendency to think of it as one thing, and it isn't. And so, I think to answer that question, let me just say I think that there are at least three variables that we probably need to consider. And the first is around what type of public health regulations are being put in place. It's not all over the world that we're seeing full lockdowns happening. Ghana, for example, has just lifted its lockdown on economic activity. South Africa and Peru are going into phased approaches. And different types of public health regulations are going to have different impacts on different groups in the informal economy. The second is that it's also dependent on the specific set of economic relationships in which the workers are embedded. So if you're a worker in a global supply chain, the impacts are likely to be worse, depending on what sector that's in, than somebody who is in a domestic food distribution chain, for example, where things are maybe slightly less disrupted. I also think place of work is important. If you're an urban informal worker working in public space versus a worker working in your own home, I think there are going to be different impacts of restrictions on movement in public place. And then I think maybe another one is the type of informal economy in which the workers are embedded. In a middle income country like South Africa, it's been very hard for informal workers to make the case that they actually are essential workers. And it's because we have a big formal sector that tends to dominate. Whereas that's not the case in West Africa. It's kind of well recognized that the informal food vending sector is what keeps the city's food distribution alive. And that's clear to everybody. So I just wanted to make those sort of points about the different ways that the situation is impacting on different groups of workers. There are, of course, some general issues. So if we take domestic workers, for example, many of them are being left without income at all. Employers have lost their jobs and are unable to pay them wages, or employers are just abdicating all responsibility for paying wages. A lot of the work the International Domestic Workers Federation is doing at national level, particularly in Latin America, is trying to work with employers' associations to get employers to recognize either their responsibilities to pay workers, or sort of appealing to them on humanitarian grounds to do so. In some countries, though, domestic workers are allowed to work as essential services, as nannies and cooks and so on. And there you're probably seeing them, with an increase in workload, particularly where they're now having to look after children the whole day who are not at school. And a high risk to health if they are working. These are people who are in other people's intimate spaces. And we're also seeing the stigmatization of domestic workers as carriers of disease, as spreaders of disease. So a lot of negative consequences there. If we think about home workers working in global supply chains, subcontracted workers who maybe stitch garments in their own homes, there have been disruptions to those supply chains. The orders are not coming from Europe or the States to a lot of Asian countries. Sometimes they have completed work and they're not being paid for it. And there's very little recourse to any kind of justice they can access around that. What we are hearing is that unpaid care work has increased substantially. So they may not be engaging in paid work at the moment, but their sort of workload as a whole has doubled. And that's particularly severe in communities with poor access to basic services. And we know that poor access to basic services increases unpaid care work as well. Street vendors, in some cases, if food vendors have been declared as essential workers, and that has been seen as a victory by some informal workers. But then having to face high costs, high additional costs. So having to pay for their own personal protective equipment, having to try and source hand washing equipment and soap. Also, sometimes even having been declared essential workers, facing harassment from local authorities. There's definitely been an uptick, particularly in Africa, of harassment happening to workers in public space. And of course, the health risks are there as well, and often workers not having adequate protection.
Great, thank you. So Gautam, building a little bit on that to understand what's happening in India specifically, where I understand 80% of the country's labor force is in the informal sector, and where women are a very large portion of this workforce. How has the pandemic personally affected them, and are there some occupations that are being hit harder than others?
So in India, I think the situation has been really very difficult because we have one of the most stringent lockdowns around the world. So movement is very severely restricted. There is almost no non-essential movement at all. And so informal worker livelihoods have been hit very directly, precisely because of what Laura was saying. For a large majority of informal workers, there isn't a work from home unless you're a home-based worker. But there's also not a work from office. The workspace is the public space. It's roads, streets, landfills, other people's homes, natural markets, and the like. So in India, in Indian cities, there has been a complete shutdown of all of these workspaces. So in a recent phone survey interview that colleagues in my university did, 68% of workers reported receiving almost no or largely 75% reductions in income over the first 2 weeks of the lockdown. So there is a very strong disproportionate impact of the lockdown and its spatial controls on informal workers, precisely because of the spatiality of where they work. And the absence of this, the idea of work from home is not a metaphor that translates for informal workers. The second point I think that's been very, very difficult for informal workers is that, there have been appeals for wages not to be held back by employers. There are government regulations, there are government orders. But precisely because of the nature of the informal employment contract, these are not enforceable in the informal economy. There aren't legal recourses to be made. I think in some way we have seen, in many cases, domestic workers, for example, for the first 2 weeks of the lockdown, we didn't see withholding of salaries. And that's partly because there is also a unique situation in India. For the first time, the government messaging has explicitly spoken about informal workers. It's asked and appealed to not reduce wages for sanitation workers, for domestic workers, etc. And I think that for the first 2 weeks of the lockdown, 3 weeks of the lockdown, it stayed. But the risks are very different at day 15 than day 50. And employers are now also unable to say, keep letting either not to retrenchment or to salaries. So in an absence of a formal employment contract, the vulnerability of these workers to retrenchment is very, very high. The third thing that I think has made it very difficult is that the cycles of earning and informal work are very different from the kind of elite cycles of a monthly salary package. Most informal workers are either own account workers, which means it's a street vendor who sells and earns every day. And many of them are daily wage workers, even if they're waged workers. So what happens in that cycle is that you actually have a savings and consumption and income cycle that is on a 24-hour cycle. And so 3 days without income, 7 days without income, 15 days without income, and essentially without a safety net, you are actually in.
Looks like we may have lost Gautam for a minute. Oh.
Sorry, am I back now?
Yes, you're back. Thank you.
Okay. So, so you take the example of a city like Delhi, 2 million of Delhi's workers are daily wage earners, which means that you've got a very severe income disruption. And the response has had to be actually very large scale public feeding. So in Delhi, for example, the government feeds cooked food twice a day in nearly 2,000 government-run schools. There are food distribution systems that have been expanded. There are cash transfer programs. But the fact that a large-scale public feeding program had to be instituted tells you about the vulnerability of many of the workers of urban India. And I think that this is a challenge of such enormous scale that no matter how much a state program tries to do it, it is impossible to sustain as the lockdown continues. And we are now at 50 days of lockdown. And the last point I'll say is that, very often there is a coincidence in a lot of informal workers' lives, is that they also tend to live in informal settlements. So they tend to live in neighborhoods that are dense built environments, that have very weak and poor infrastructure. So therefore, the questions of social distancing, the question of access to sanitation, are doubly compounded. So actually, for many informal workers, it's about uncertain terms of residence as much as it is in uncertain terms of employment. And these are a sort of vicious cycle that feed into each other. Only sanitation and waste workers have been declared essential workers in the Indian context. All the other workers for the first phases of the lockdown were not allowed. They're now beginning to slowly phase and ease entry out of lockdown. We leave the next round on Monday. So we'll see how much new employment picks up. But the general conversation around the country is basically that we cannot economically survive or sustain a longer lockdown. So it's a very difficult choice.
Yeah. So Geeta, Gautam was just mentioning that the sanitation and waste workers were considered essential. We know that waste pickers are critical to keeping the country's communities healthy and safe. I know you've worked very closely with waste pickers through the 3D program. And could you share a story that helps us understand how life has changed for these women as a result of some of these lockdown measures under COVID-19?
Sure, Amy, and thank you so much for focusing on informal workers through your series and on waste pickers in particular. So the 3D program for girls and women works in Pune city, which is the second largest city in Maharashtra after Mumbai. And we've been working there very closely with innovative, committed cooperative called Swachh. It's a cooperative of waste pickers. They're about 65% of the membership is women. And the majority of those women are Dalit women, which is a marginalized caste community. And they live in very poor slum communities in the city. And they earn their living by collecting, sorting, selling, recycling waste, essentially all kinds of waste. They are about a total of 8,000, over 8,300 workers. I mean, sorry, not 8,000, 3,800 workers. Who are in Swachh, and they service about 850,000 households across the city for a fee that the household pays. So that's who we're working with. As you can imagine, they provide a very important public service, and it's a service that contributes to the city's economy, to its public health, and to environmental sustainability. They also, I have to say, save the municipal corporation enormous amounts of money, because otherwise the municipal corporation would be dependent on a corporate garbage company that would be much less financially or environmentally sustainable. And yet, despite all of that, even under the best of circumstances, waste pickers are discriminated against because they're invisible, they're unrecognized, they're harassed by the police and by citizens, and they don't necessarily get all of the social benefits that even though the government provides those, because of complex bureaucratic systems, difficulty in accessing them. So what we're doing through the 3D program is working with the cooperative, as well as with the local think tank called the Center for Environment Education, as well as with the municipal corporation. So the government is also involved, to increase the earnings of the waste pickers by expanding their role in solid waste management in the city, by improving their access to government benefits and services, and by increasing their safety in, as Gautam said, their workplace is the city, is the streets of the city. So to make them safe there in the neighborhoods in which they work. So the onset of COVID-19, it was interesting because the government actually deemed them as essential workers because garbage still had to be picked up from households. So initially, they went about their work very bravely, very committed to keep the city clean, going about collecting and sorting through the garbage. And as a result, were exposed to enormous health risks because the government did not provide them with all of the personal protective equipment that they needed to do their job, and the cooperative stepped in to try and fill some of those gaps. And they were stigmatized and harassed because, like Laura said, they were often seen as being carriers of the disease. And I'll give you just one quick story of a waste picker, Anjana Gorke, who was actually thrown out of her home by her landlord because she continued to collect and sort garbage from 350 households that she served. So she had to leave at very short notice with very few of her belongings. and had to rent a separate place and pay in both places the rent. So she was out of pocket for it, but because she was committed to continuing to do her work. More recently, however, some of the spaces where they live, some of the communities in which they live, have been marked as hotspots by the government. And so now entry and exit from those communities is very difficult. So it's now affecting their livelihoods in a major way. They're unable to conduct their work. But fortunately, and here's the big thing about informal workers, when they organize into a collective, that collective power has allowed them to negotiate with the government to get a new life insurance policy, health insurance, as well as access to food rations, even if they don't have a ration card, or even if they don't necessarily comply with all of the Food Security Act requirements. So there's a lot to be said for collective action and its power for informal workers.
Fascinating. So we're hearing about the extraordinarily kind of difficult circumstances, living on a cycle that's basically a 24-hour cycle from work to consumption, and what that means, the kind of space that where you work is the public space, the kind of risks of where the informal workers often reside. And then added to that is often the further harassment that they receive and stigmatization. So you've all mentioned a number of policy responses that you're seeing happen. So let's dig into those a little bit. And Laura, so we were hearing that some of these workers are now being deemed essential workers. And of course, we've always known that they are the backbone of society, but now getting this official designation means they're expected to put their life on the line every day to do these essential jobs. What are some additional things that you believe need to happen now to support these women as this pandemic continues on? Even as sort of certain things are being lifted, the pandemic is continuing, and there's obviously fears that we're going to have spikes that are going to result in sort of potentially for future lockdowns or future pandemics. So what can we do now?
So, I mean, part of that is about ensuring that informal workers are integrated into social protection schemes on a longer term basis. I mean, one of the big things this crisis has highlighted is how unsustainable it is to have 61% of the world's workers uncovered by social protection, so that when a crisis hits, there is nothing to cover them. There is nothing to help with income replacement. So I would say even now, governments across the world are trying desperately to work out how they can get a cash grant to a group of workers they've never tried to cover before. And that just makes it so much harder to put in place the crisis response. The countries that have been able to move the fastest are the ones that have made some attempt to provide coverage for informal workers. So, I mean, I think we need to see this time now as an opportunity to be bringing those informal workers who were previously uncovered into the social protection net. And I think going forward, we need to work out how to expand that. Because by social protection, I mean, either the cash grants, so that there's a direct form of income replacement that workers can access when their incomes are interrupted, or it could be nutrition and food support. As we've seen in India, that's been one of the important ways to get support to people. I think as well, additional consideration for women is support for caring roles. Many of the children who were in school are not now in school. What support do women workers need who are deemed essential workers? How are they dealing with the care needs that they're now having to juggle even more furiously than they were before? Maybe it's about an additional grant supplement that allows them to buy in some additional childcare. Maybe it's about thinking how we reopen childcare centres in a safe and hygienic way in areas where informal workers are located. I think what's important to point out with the essential workers is that even though they're allowed to continue working, many of them are still facing a significant drop in income. And part of that is because of the higher input costs they're having to deal with. So if we think about a newspaper vendor in Peru who has been deemed an essential worker, she can continue to work, but she's only allowed to work selling from door to door. She's not allowed to sell from her kiosk on the roadside. So now she needs to pay not only for her own personal protective equipment, her mask and gloves and so on as she goes door to door, she's also having to pay for her own transport because of the public transport restrictions that have been put in place. She's having to hire an Uber to get from neighborhood to neighborhood so that she can sell her papers. So there's been she's not getting that passing trade and she's facing these high input costs. There is a need for some kind of income replacement there as well, even though she's an essential worker. I think the second thing to say is that this really highlights the need for occupational health and safety for workers in the informal economy and women workers in particular. We have worked with groups of informal workers on this topic for several years. And I remember one of the workers in Thailand said, nobody, public health world doesn't take occupational health and safety seriously. It's the ugly stepchild of public health. And I think there's definitely something in that. And in occupational health and safety, informal workers just fall through the cracks in so many ways. The formal discipline focuses on formal workplaces, is often dominated by the private sector. Women workers and the needs of women workers tend not to be taken, very seriously by occupational health and safety. And then, you have the whole thing of how do you get occupational health and safety provisions to workers who are not in employment contracts and work in public space. But I really think this is an opportunity for the world of public health and the world of occupational health to come together in a stronger way. Ensuring that there is hand washing and water facilities near informal workplaces is going to be critical. I mean, the Rwandan government did a wonderful thing right at the start by ensuring that all bus stations had portable hand wash stations and soap available. And there are ways to do this in relatively affordable, accessible ways. And I think the provision, both Geeta and Gautam have mentioned the provision of personal protective equipment. You can't designate a group of incredibly vulnerable workers as essential workers and then do nothing to make sure that they're protected while they work. That has to be the government's responsibility if they are considering this group of workers to be essential workers. And perhaps there are other forms of support. It's quite interesting in Brazil. Groups of waste pickers have been able to access an additional income replacement grant through the private sector, through the extended producer responsibility laws, which state that manufacturers have responsibility for the end life of their products. And waste pickers are often the people who are dealing with the end life of the product. And so manufacturers have felt some responsibility through that economic relationship to contribute to workers. And I think that there's, that's many ways in which the private sector relationships could be leveraged to make sure that there is personal protective equipment going out to workers as well.
Great. So Gautam, picking up on some of the comments that Laura made, and also what you had said previously around many of the actions that the government has been trying to take, the statements it's been making in support of continuing the wages for the informal workers, the sort of food feeding programs. Can you kind of help us understand, how is this evolving in real time in India, and sort of why is it so important, and what, how is it playing out? Like, what more needs to be done now?
I think, there's we're in a very strange moment, because in one way you have a kind of focused attention. Like Laura was saying, there's a lot that has been made very evident, which was an open secret, which was the extent of vulnerability and poverty still in the Indian society. And I think India has sort of told a story about itself, which is not untrue, that we've had 20 very good years and you're a rising global player. But I think that it is a very timely reminder to us about the extent of vulnerability of most of our workers. And I think that one of the things that is disappointing was that when the lockdown was put in, its first nature did not anticipate or say, if I do a lockdown like this that shuts down all public space and all public transport, here is the kind of human development, social and economic impacts it will have on these kinds of workers. So we have a kind of strange policy schism where we still speak of our economy in very standard economic terms about enterprise and firm and capital investment and rebuild credit and build back supply chains. But we are not an economy of firms. We are an economy of informal workers. And so there's a real conceptual schism in, what economic stimulus packages are being, announced right now. And they're not centered on rebuilding worker lives. They're re-centered on building back the formal economy. And this is a deep structural problem in all countries are going to face, because your GDP growth rate, which is on the first page of the Economic Times, comes from high capital output industry. But your employment does not come from those high capital output industries. There are very few industries. Construction is the one exception, which pulls both your output up, but also pulls your employment up. So, I'll say two things that I think are critical at this point, very briefly. The first is, what we have right now as relief is actually a very good map of what we should have normally as social protection. This is actually the level of public food support we should have. This is actually the level of income support we should have. We should not, what we are doing as a disaster relief is actually a map of what our normal social protection should look like. Because if most of our workers are 5 days away from poverty, then they are no longer supported by a safety net worth speaking of. The second is to recognize that the way we come out of the lockdown can take two routes. One of them is to really emphasize and say, how do I choose employment-induced and linked openings that is going to help me rebuild this safety net? We have a real opportunity right now to hold on to what we are right now calling relief and turn it into recovery. But the only way we're going to do that is if we don't treat relief as a stopgap measure just during the lockdown. We've got to treat it as the building of new institutions of social protection. And for this, part of it is the collective organizing of workers. And part of it is a certain recognition that certain forms of inequality are unacceptable. And that economic recovery that does not center the inequality that has become, we are right now in a point in India where every day you turn on the news and there are hundreds of our fellow citizens who are walking hundreds of kilometers on highways, walking away from cities because interstate trains are not allowed. They are walking home thousands of kilometers in heat and on tarmac because absolutely they have no way without wages to survive even 10 days in the city. If we do not respond to this moment, both ethically and strategically, we are really kind of going to set ourselves up for deeply lasting human damage. And I think that we have to be very careful about understanding the way our economy actually is, not the way we wish it would be, understanding and valuing informal workers as a core part of our economic engine, and then asking very smartly and say, what is the kind of economic stimulus that centers employment, does not center capital output on GDP? And I think that's the real crossroads we're at in India right now. It's going to be a very difficult political fight, but it is an opportunity to fight that fight that we've gotten after a very long time.
This whole concept of how do we build back better? How do we recognize what we've learned of the vulnerabilities and the gaps that we're facing and now build back better? Geeta, I want to focus you on one, sorry?
I was just saying there's a very vile meme going around saying we won't go back to normal because the normal was the problem.
Yeah. So Geeta, I'd like to switch gears for just 1 minute and zoom in on one particular group that cannot be forgotten. Laura's mentioned how important that this is actually also a public health and an occupational health issue. And I want to focus on one group in the informal sector, which is the ASHAs, the community health workers in India and the community health workers around the world. What support is needed for these heroic women to carry out their essential health jobs, which is often the sort of the face right to the community itself?
Thanks for that, Amy. Just before I talk about that, want to say that what Gautam said was so right on. There's a disconnect between what is the reality and public policy. Public policy is based on an imaginary world, not on what's the reality. And so the ASHA workers embody that as well. So ASHA, just for those who don't live in India, ASHA stands for Accredited Social Health Activists, but the word ASHA means hope in Hindi. They are community health workers who are considered to be volunteers, but are paid a small honorarium by the government. And their job is to go from house to house to provide various essential services, primarily around maternal and child health, family planning, immunization. And they do so with great commitment and with great humanity, without any benefits and entitlements from the governments, because they're considered to be outside of the government workforce in a sense. They're voluntary workers. The onset of COVID-19 has had enormous impacts on them because the government has loaded on all of the prevention, care, awareness raising duties for COVID-19 onto their existing workload. So they are now involved in trying to get this information out to households, to track those who are sick, to report to the government when they come across incidents of people who are sick. And all of this while being exposed to the risks themselves, because we are hearing from many states that they do not have the protection, the personal protective equipment that they need. So they're working with masks that they are creating themselves, without gloves, without any of the protections that they need, without hand sanitizers. So that's a big risk for them. They're also being stigmatized and harassed, just like I said about the waste pickers, because they are going household to household and are therefore seen as being as carriers of the disease. So it's a huge issue for them. They are, because of the stigma, they're also experiencing violence. There's been stories of violence against their families as well. So they desperately need our support. And I think that what Laura and Gautam have said, that they need to be eligible for social protection and for government benefits, because they are the backbone of the public health system. They're the interface between households and the public health system in India. So to think that they are doing their work and continuing to do so without personal protective equipment, without coverage of social benefits, is just startling to me. I think that that is a huge waste of their resources. You should also know that they're so overworked and overburdened that they are now unable to provide some of the other essential services. So we're learning now from our households in Pune, where we work in rural Pune, that they are not getting the menstrual hygiene management supplies, the contraceptives, the information that they need, because the ASHA workers just can't cope anymore.
So, you all have raised some extraordinary insights into sort of the system that that the economic system that the policy has solved for isn't in fact even being the reality, and how what this crisis has done is surfaced what has been an open secret, as Gautam put it, of what's really going on, that our economies are actually, many of these economies are primarily the workforce, the informal workers, and the need to have work and economic stimulus packages that are more focused on that type of employment and the recognition of it's in the informal sector more than the formal frequently. So with Women Lift Health, we're very committed to the kind of tangible actions that can be taken to ensure that the women's voices are heard by the decision makers, and even more importantly, that women's voices are the decision makers and are being represented at these critical tables. So love to kind of continue really taking your comments that you've made and continuing to push it forward into the kind of, this, let's build back better. Let's kind of not go back to the normal. Let's go back to something new. And about taking action. So Gautam, you've outlined some of these critical issues and the type of longer term support that is needed. Can you enlarge a little bit more to help us understand, like, how do we start to get an economic stimulus package, as you said, that's focused on employment? How do you get a shift in a country like India in recognizing that 80% of the employment is in fact in the informal sector, and what do we do to make this relief permanent? Gautam, you're muted.
Yes, I promise I'll be better on that. I think that some of the things that we need to be doing right now is one of the advantages I think that in India is that we have an extraordinary tradition of collective organization, to pick up Geeta's point. So it is not that knowledge on how to address or find the informal economy is not there if you just seek to look for it. India has some of the largest cooperative associations and membership-based organizations of workers. Many of them are large women's organizations. In fact, the dominant mode of collective organizing among informal workers in India are organizations of women led by women. And I think that they have very clear articulations of the ways in which informal work can be recognized and put into an interface with the state that is enabling for both. Right? Because one has to also be careful, because state recognition of informality can often also come with very restrictive regulatory frames that don't understand the flexibility of informal work. This is particularly true of gendered work, right? I think a lot of mainstream regulatory approaches to work tend to really underestimate what a gendered approach to understanding the care burden and balance of paid and unpaid work is. So I think what we need to be able to think about right now is this. First, we actually need directed income recovery programs. We need a system of getting people back the income they have lost over the last 50 days. And I think this cannot be considered a safety net. It actually simply has to be considered destitution prevention. So we need a large-scale system of cash transfers and resource transfers to informal workers. These must be targeted to informal workers, by which I mean that there must be specific packages for domestic workers and street vendors. And the reason I say this targeting is good, because one of the hard things is, even if you're a government who wants to give cash transfers to informal workers, it's not clear how to find them. It's also not clear unless you partner with them and their organizations. And this is where you go back to collective organizing. Right now, the government is not inviting workers to them and say, we are here to do income recovery, but we need help in understanding, locating, identifying beneficiaries, and setting up mechanisms of transfer. South Africa is lucky in this system. They've got a cash transfer system. We don't. So the fact that we never had a universal safety net puts us at a great disadvantage. It means we need to build it. So the summary of what I'm saying is essentially that this is a moment in which we need to experiment and innovate to build new institutions of social protection and its delivery. And we should use that by taking the leadership of workers' organizations who have well laid out plans on how to do this and invite them to be partners with the state. The state cannot set up the safety net on its own, not for the informal economy.
So Laura, what Gautam has said sounds like it would also hold often on the global stage as well. Do you have any other kind of additional recommendations that build on what policymakers need to be working on as they focus on not only pandemic preparedness, but more the resiliency and recovery?
Yeah, I mean, I think Gautam has said very well about sort of working with organizations. And I just want to emphasize how important I think that is, because I think too often it gets lost. And India is lucky in that it's got big organizations. It's not always the case in the rest of the world. And I think producing an environment that is conducive to organizing, so not the state doing the organizing, but creating an environment in which organizations can thrive is something the state can be involved in. And I do think that's important. And within that, the promotion of women's leadership within those organizations, I think, is critical. I think just on the macroeconomics, I also wanted to say that sort of employment-focused macroeconomic recovery package is really important, but taking it maybe down to the more micro level, I think there's two things. We can think of the way that we can support informal workers in two ways, and one is reducing the negatives. So especially in urban informal work, workers face a lot of negative forces which undermine their ability to earn and will undermine their ability to recover. So stigmatization, harassment from police and from local authorities who feel that informal workers should not be working in public space. Regulations which state that it's illegal to be working in public space. Accepting the reality that this is what is going on and trying to work with that. I think as well, reducing things like loan repayments, giving loan holidays, reducing the amounts of taxes, fees, and licenses that informal workers have to pay in order to operate in public spaces. All of these sort of reductions of the negatives are small but very effective ways to support informal livelihoods. And then the next thing is, increasing the positives. Livelihood restarter funds that are accessible to informal workers. Universal health coverage, universal social protection, universal childcare, particularly if we're serious about women informal workers, are all going to be critical to helping informal workers reestablish themselves in the long run. And I just wanted to add, Gautam said South Africa was lucky in that we have a universal social, we have child support grants and old age pensions, and that's true. And it has allowed us to respond, well enough. But we have never tried to reach the informal economy. And so South Africa has also had to scramble to try and reach informal workers and find a way to reach informal workers with the social protection system. And this is happening all over the world. And so the expansion and the inclusion of informal workers into social protection systems is going to be critical to long-term sort of resilience to these kinds of shocks. And I think finally, just to say that never again should we have such a division between public health responses and social protection. Social protection needs to be built into the public health responses. Malawi, the government tried to impose a lockdown and the Constitutional Court said, no, you will not impose a lockdown until you can make provision for all of your vulnerable citizens. And I think that's really important, that we need to keep those two goals in mind together. Thanks.
Thank you. So Gita, one last question, and then I'm going to the audience questions. So please do be sending in your any questions you have via the chat lines. So we've heard a lot about sort of different policy actions at the state level. I'm wondering if you can kind of take a different lens and share what are the kinds of actions that women in positions of power and influence, like yourself, should be taking.
It's a good question. And before I go to that, I just want to underscore 2 points that were made by Gautam and Laura. One is the solution to the vulnerability of informal workers is not to make them formalized, because I can tell you from the waste pickers we work with, they do not want that, because it greatly reduces the flexibility of their work. And the second point that I want to make is that Laura's point about public health and social protection have to go together. We've been shouting this from the rooftops, that the two things, the socioeconomic impacts on vulnerable populations have to be taken into account right from the start. In both Ebola and in HIV, we did it too late. And I hope this time we will learn the lesson forever. In terms of actions that women can take who are in leadership positions, I go back to the term that you used, Amy, to describe Women Lift Health, which is tangible actions. That's the stage of life that I'm at now, which is I want to take tangible actions. After a lot of blah, blah, blah at the top, I'm at the stage where I want to be doing something specific. And I think one of the missing pieces that I'm trying to address with my team through the 3D program and with all of our partners is to create platforms where women can come together, whether that's an existing platform like a cooperative of waste pickers, or new platforms for rural women to come together, for example, to be able to voice what issues they are facing in their daily lives and what solutions might exist, because they often are the best aware of what the solutions are, but not just to enable them to do that, because that goes nowhere, but to be able to provide a feedback loop to those in power, to those who can make a difference. So if you're taking women at a village level, how can you create the feedback loop so that block development officials will listen, so that the people at the Zilla Parishad level, at the district level will listen? It's, the government has no feedback loops in place at the moment. They occasionally do these town hall kind of, discussions or conversations with people. So that's what we're trying to set up. And I think that's one tangible action that I have personally put in place. And I encourage everyone working in the field to think of what are ways to feed back those realities to well-meaning government officials often, who just don't know what the realities are, so that we can move, open the drapes, the curtains that hide the reality from them in their daily work. And then the second thing I would say, which is what makes me so proud to be a part of Women Lift Health, is I have for most of my life, and I encourage all women in any position of leadership or power to do the same, which is to mentor younger women and to bring them along in their professional careers. I made a commitment to that many years ago. And I think that, we need to pay forward. And I think that that's what Women Lift Health is doing. And it's really something we desperately need, because we need more women with their lived realities to feed into decision-making.
Thank you. So we're going to move to the questions. I'm very struck by the insights that you all have shared on what it means to be in the informal sector, and sort of these very special conditions, the subsistence, the daily daily income to food, the living conditions, the being largely like overlooked, even though providing essential services that all depend on. And I've been very struck in particular how you've highlighted that this crisis has helped to surface what was known, what was the open secret, what has made kind of more visible these absolutely essential workers who are playing these critical roles, and that we need to remember this role and then be building back better to be addressing it. And the importance that, in fact, having the voices of these workers and of these women as part of the decision making, that, for example, that these collectives already exist, that these women leaders in these collectives have a much better understanding of some of the most effective solutions and the actual realities and how to start to address them. And it is about getting those voices at the table to be part of these sort of longer term solutions and part of structuring some of these policy and financing mechanisms going forward. I want to bring out a couple questions that we've heard. So here's one for you, Gautam. Our audience asked, can city-based policies and specific policies be the way forward? A move from central and provincial government to more city administrations and localizing solutions?
So, when you think about the urban as a setting for informal work, and we say that much of that work is in public space, actually municipal and urban administration should be exactly the right level of state you should be interacting with, because this is about natural markets, this is about public space design, this is about regulating sidewalks, about working with very much what are municipal and local administrative issues. In India, what's challenging is that unlike many other parts of the world, we actually have very weak city administration. Our power is centralized at the state level, and therefore, for example, in many parts of the world, the mayor is the most important person in the city. In India, inner cities don't have mayors. We don't have powerful local government. There's a long history for it. So it is, theoretically, I would love to agree with you, but in practicality, for most of our cities, we will have to do a mix of working at the municipal level, but also at the state government level. And I think that this is just a complication of the way our system works. But in practice, the life world of our solutions is very much the city. So it has to play out in its streets and its markets and its regulatory frameworks. But I think what's important is something that Laura brought on, which is us to remember that the informal economy goes from very precarious, very localized work. I'm a street vendor who sells to workers who live in my neighborhood, to home-based workers who are part of global supply chains. So an agility of being able to move across scale and recognizing that different sectors and different forms of informal work are embedded and play out at different scales is essential. When we say the informal economy is the dominant part of the workforce, it's also, that means global and multi-scalar and complex. It's not just a world of precarity and vulnerability, it's very sophisticated. And so it has to be treated with that. So we will have to be multi-scalar, we'll have to be flexible, but certainly the city region is going to be, and local government and municipal government is going to be your primary interface.
So great reminder. This is it, and I think Laura started it off on this footing. It is a very diverse group. We're talking about 2/3 of the world's employees, and it is ranging from highly localized to being part of a global supply chain. It is an extraordinarily heterogeneous group. Geeta, can you maybe bring some sense of how do these challenges that we've been talking about a lot of India and Africa, but what does this mean for women in the informal sector in the US? And how can you give us sort of a sense of that group?
So I don't work that much in the US, so with that caveat, but just from what I know, being a citizen here, I can tell you that US informal workers have a bit more security because they can access Medicaid and other sort of social protection schemes and benefits and so on, as long as they are documented as residents or as citizens, right? So undocumented informal workers, of which there are many and of which the US economy is entirely dependent. There are huge sections of work that are conducted in our cities, for example, or in our towns, and in our farms that wouldn't happen without undocumented workers. So, so if you are documented, yes, you are protected some through access to services, which is different from many of the low and middle income countries in which I've worked through my career. However, there's an advantage in a country like India or even South Africa and many other countries is that informal workers have begun to organize, have begun to create collectives. They've begun to unionize and so on, so that they get collective bargaining power, which happens much less here in the US. The power of the collective doesn't exist here in the US. So to negotiate for change requires outsiders to speak on your behalf. You know, you need the lawyers to take a case to court and so on. So it's a very different process. The kind of robust, exciting collective action that you see in India and South Africa is not what you see in the US as much. I hope it happens. It's beginning to happen. I know domestic workers are being organized. I know wage earners are being organized, farm laborers. I know there's a long history of them being organized, but it's not quite as visible and as happening as much here is my sense.
Gautam, did you want to add to that?
Just to say that, the last ILO State of the Informal Economy report put figures of informal employment in the US at 18% of all workers. So it's not as small a number as one may think.
But very overlooked. It is our overlooked workforce. Laura, I'm going to ask you to see, I want to draw on one of your stories. We understand, I was reading some of the recent rapid assessment that you did on the impact of COVID-19 on the livelihoods for those in the informal sector. And would love for you to share one kind of illuminating stories from one of the women that was part of this rapid assessment.
Well, I think I shared a bit of it earlier, but one that's really stuck with me is Juana Corman from Lima, who's the newspaper vendor. And I thought it was such an interesting story because it really revealed, both the fact that informal workers are essential, but at the same time, how vulnerable they are. So, a newspaper vendor, is an essential service because it's how we keep the information flowing. But then at the same time having to, and it also, what struck me about it was the way that sort of it tied into how urban systems work as well. So this question of cities and the issue of transport. That, then again, it's that issue of putting in place public health regulations without thinking through the livelihood components. That if we suddenly shut down our public transport system, there are going to be a whole lot of economic actors in the city who can't actually carry out their work anymore. And I thought that was very interesting. So I found that story striking, both because of the way it highlighted the essential nature of informal workers, but also brought up their vulnerabilities to health risks and additional costs that they're having to bear. We always say that, informal workers have to bear higher costs and risks than formal workers because they're the ones having to bear the costs themselves. There's nobody who's going to pay for their protective equipment. And then also the link into urban systems. And I think that difference between the rural and urban is quite important. A lot of the social safety nets that have been put in place around the world sort of target rural workers. And it's about rural livelihoods. And the urban space is a very different space. Workers in urban areas face very different challenges. And I think that was, it highlighted those three aspects to me.
So definitely a great report to read for people looking for some of these stories. We're coming to time right now, so I want to leave one final question for all of the speakers to respond to, perhaps beginning with Geeta. So, what do you want world leaders to take away from this conversation, to understand about the informal workforce? What's your major message?
My major message to them is get real. Look around you, see what realities your fellow people live in, and recognize that that's what will get you glory. That's what's going to get you a reputation of being a good leader, is if you pay attention to how to protect the most vulnerable. And if the most vulnerable are such a large part of your population and you implement public policy that doesn't keep them in mind, it doesn't say much about you as a leader.
Laura?
I would say the issue of employment being key to the poverty reduction. I think in the poverty agenda, we very often don't hear or see the words employment enough, and how central, better forms of employment that's better protected, not necessarily formalized, but better protected, how central that is to the poverty alleviation agenda. And that's not to say everybody needs to work in an office, but it is to say that people should have access to social protection, to healthcare, and those things, no matter where and what work that they are doing.
Thank you. And Gautam, the last word.
I mean, if there were leaders, I think that the way that I would love for them to think is to really sort of recognize at scale what this global epidemic is telling us about the sustainability of our current economic and ecological paradigm. I think this is a very strong wake-up call that some of our business as usual models are not just inequitable, but I live in one of the most polluted cities in the world that over the last 50 days has had more blue skies than in the last 2 years. And there is a really interesting question here, a possibility of a meeting of ecological commons with equitable and inclusive development. But it requires a real moment where you stop and rethink what we have meant by economic development. I think this is the first of, some folks are calling this the first crisis of the Anthropocene, that we have really gotten to a point of changing the global balance. I think we have to tell a different story about the world and what it means to progress and what it means to live a better life. And I think that this is literally the time to ask that question, to go back to one of the most fundamental questions is, what do you mean by a life worth living? And we need to rethink some of our core assumptions here and change some parts. And if this doesn't get us to do it as a species, I don't know what else will.
Thank you all so much for sharing your extraordinary insights, your recommendations of what can be done now, and importantly, how we need to be using this moment as that wake-up call to be thinking about how do we build it back differently? How do we build back better so we just don't go back to the same challenges, the same extraordinary vulnerabilities that we've been ignoring for so long? Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.